Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into a truly fascinating and, highly debated topic. We're going to unpack a pretty provocative argument laid out by Coach de Bruins. He directly connects human evolutionary biology to the very structures of marriage. Now, whether you agree with his premise or absolutely disagree, understanding exactly how he constructs this argument is a fantastic exercise in analyzing biological determinism. It's going to be an interesting ride, so let's get into it.
Okay, let's dive into this step by step. We're going to start by defining our terms, then we'll outline the 3 pillars of marriage, examine the biological argument, look at his critique of monogamy, and finally, explore how society regulates instinct.
Section 1. Defining the terms. Polygamy versus polygyny.
First things first, to really understand this framework, we have to pin down the exact terminology the source is using. You hear the word polygamy thrown around a lot, usually as a broad umbrella term. But the specific focus of this entire argument is actually polygyny. What is that? Well, it specifically defines a man having more than one wife or having more than one partner at the exact same time. The speaker is very careful to distinguish this from polyandry, which is a woman having multiple spouses. So, just to be crystal clear, for the sake of everything we're about to cover, our focus is strictly on polygyny.
Section 2. The 3 pillars of marriage. Foundation of unions.
So think about what actually makes a marriage function. According to the speaker, it's definitely not just a social construct. He argues it serves 3 highly specific biological and social functions that go way beyond that initial spark of attraction. Number 1 is mating. This is driven by natural attraction, essentially acting as a baseline survival mechanism to propagate the species. Number 2 is emotional bonds. You absolutely need these to facilitate longevity and mutual cooperation so you can actually raise the children created by that mating. And number 3 is propriety. In this context, it's specifically the male's propriety, which serves to clearly and legally connect the father to his children.
Section 3. The biological argument. Determinism in mating.
Now, what's really interesting here is the absolute crux of his thesis. The speaker grounds his entire argument in biological determinism. He argues that the primary baseline instinct for sexual attraction between men and women, well, it's actually not for fun. Rather, it serves a very strict biological function, which is ensuring the woman becomes pregnant so the human species can perpetuate.
And that brings us to the number 9. 9 months. The source points out that once a woman is pregnant, she naturally bears the biological responsibility of carrying that child for 9 whole months. During this long period, and honestly often through the breastfeeding phase that follows, sex no longer serves a significant biological function for her propagation. But, and here's the kicker, the man's biological capacity hasn't paused at all. The speaker argues this disconnect leads to a natural, unguided male instinct to seek out other mates. It's essentially nature's way of saying, okay, you've done your job over here, time to move on and propagate some more.
Just to put that into perspective, look at this stark mathematical contrast the source heavily relies on. We're talking about biological potential in just a single year. Technically speaking, one man has the biological capacity to sire 50, 100, or even 200 children in a year, depending on his partners. A woman, on the exact same timeline, typically gives birth to 1 child a year. Maybe up to 4 if she has quadruplets, right? The speaker describes this massive biological spectrum between male and female as being literally like night and day.
So from those raw numbers, the source derives a highly specific conclusion. He argues that men are fundamentally biologically designed to be polygynous. The speaker actually uses this underlying biological reality to explain why we see higher likelihoods of infidelity among men in society. He acknowledges that guys might not consciously think about it this way, but men who stray from monogamous marriages are, according to this argument, essentially just following a baseline biological blueprint to fertilize multiple partners.
Section 4. The critique of monogamy. Challenging exclusivity.
Building on that math, the source heavily critiques modern expectations of marriage, and it takes a really provocative stance here. He says, demanding that this creature remain eternally loyal and sexually exclusive with one woman for his entire life is ludicrous. The speaker is basically claiming that lifelong exclusivity is a direct contradiction to male biology. To expect it as a universal baseline is, in his view, completely ignoring the reality of the human animal.
Furthermore, the source makes the claim that when we see people abandoning marriage left and right in today's society, they aren't necessarily rejecting the core concept of marriage itself. Instead, they are turning their backs on what he calls institutional monogamy.
The argument posits that demanding strict monogamy in a system ultimately designed for the furtherance of civilization creates a totally unfeasible, unrealistic environment that is prone to completely self-destructing.
So the crucial point is captured perfectly in this quote: enforced monogamy is an illusion of gigantic proportions. The source argues that historically, whenever populations actually seemed inclined toward monogamy, it was mostly just an illusion. And that illusion was maintained solely through the intense coercion of society and the church, rather than being an honest reflection of true, natural human behavior.
But all of this brings us to a massive looming question, doesn't it? If raw, unguided biology naturally drives this polygynous behavior, how on earth does a functioning society actually regulate it? Because pure biological instinct without any boundaries would just be total chaos.
Section 5. Regulating instinct. The social contract. The speaker draws a really sharp, definitive distinction to answer that. He outlines a synthesis. Raw sexual behavior does bring negative consequences to civilization, so it absolutely must be controlled. Polygyny, within his framework, is emphatically not just sleeping around willy-nilly. It's framed completely differently. Responsible polygyny is presented as a highly structured social contract, bound by strict rules of marriage and very heavy responsibilities.
Let's move along and see how this builds into a functional system. The social contract of polygyny requires significant input and responsibility from both parties. Because of the heavy rights and duties involved, especially when it comes to fiercely protecting children's rights, a responsible polygynous man is naturally limited to the number of wives he can actually, practically manage and provide for. The speaker points out that this organic regulation of sexual behavior has strong historical precedents. He notes that structured polygyny has been practiced for centuries and is deeply rooted in the religious traditions of the biblical and Quranic prophets within Abrahamic monotheism.
To summarize his final thesis, it basically boils down to biology versus ideology. Because the biological realities of men and women are, as he said, like night and day, the speaker argues that forcing both genders to follow the exact same, identical sexual rules is an unrealistic ideological stance, one that fundamentally denies our basic human nature.
And that leaves us with a really profound final thought to chew on. Can constructed societal laws and ideologies ever truly override our raw evolutionary biology, or must our institutions eventually adapt to it? It is a deeply fascinating tension to consider. Thanks for exploring this argument with me today.